you stay here next to me? We'll just keep driving. Because of you I see a light. The Buick's a century, 73 like you. Some strange religion. I get my hands on some money, mama, and a shot at night. Stare down the past and just guard my eyes. Now I know there's no easy ride. She's been the kind who would take it in stride. Some jagged diamonds kicked her heart around. Did they know they were walking on holy ground? I almost called it a day so many times. Didn't know what it felt like to be alive. Nobody else could be. Keep my hands on the wheel now, mama. I'm gonna honestly try. Past the scars and the burned out eyes, and could see I'm no easy ride. She's just the kind who might get you to buy some strange religion. These jagged diamonds kicked her heart around. Known they were walking on holy ground. This life might eventually just be the end of me, and I'll still be with you. As they get in next to me, just keep driving. I've been alive, and this Buick's a century, 73 like you. Some strange religion. The Buick's a century, 73 like you. Some strange religion.
Okay. Thank you, Mark Lanigan. Seattleite, I believe. No longer with us. I didn't know that. I just learned that this morning when I pulled up this song. Not like I'm a huge fan of the guy. I've always known about him. He's always been great. He used to lead a band in Seattle back in the grunge days. One of the better bands from that time. I forget, but I think he had headed up a band. So I went. This is a song I've only heard, like for a few months ago. But so I went and pulled it up. I thought that would be a good one to start out the Bible study. And then I see there's all this stuff. I almost didn't use the song because I see there's some connection with frickin' Anthony Bourdain, who I don't really know anything about. I get a sense that if I knew anything about Anthony Bourdain, I'd fucking hate him. And I don't want to hate dead dead sops who, killed themselves over some woman, poor bastard. But I just get the impression that Anthony Bourdain is one of these sort of glib intellectuals that, midwits think is some sort of fucking brilliant guy. I just suspect that, that I wouldn't like Anthony Bourdain. So, I am not bringing you this song because I found it by way of Anthony frickin' Bourdain. I'm just petty vain enough to think it's important to stress that. Oh yeah, hi Phil. Phil says the YouTube witch Susan Wojcicki sure died quick. Once she left the CEO position, it's like the evil she was doing kept her alive. Yeah. I think that might be it. I mean, well, Satan, he uses you, and when he's done with you, he discards you. He discards you quickly. And that's a good theme for today's Bible study. Satan has no loyalty. He pays well, but once he he takes far more. You sign that contract in blood. Just know it's going to be fun for a while, and then it's going to be really bad when he takes you. Susan Wojcicki. I don't know much about her. She only came to my attention late when she started shutting everything down. And some people are like, she might have been awful at the end, but she helped build YouTube or Google or whatever the fuck. Bear is an Anthony Bourdain groupie. I love how he stated openly that the only way humanity will survive is if we, for a large mocha Kalergi blend, also known as fuck our way out of this. I think you're being ironic. What's he talking about? Really? I've heard this from people, and thank you, Bear. This is exactly why I suspected I would have hated Anthony Bourdain, because he's this guy, like Bill Mayer tier, right? This guy who just smart enough to think he's smart, but just like, glib, stupid. Yeah, so I think what Bear is saying is that Anthony Bourdain probably used to say, we just need to all fuck each other and become one bland race, one mocha-colored bland race. I think probably of ugly people. And that's it. But by the way, diversity is awesome. But the only way out of this is to totally erase it. God forbid we should try to be adults and say, hey, maybe white people have a place in this whole diverse human family, because I actually think it's kind of cool that there are all these different species of man. Species. But they want feces. I say species over feces. Yeah, what they want is a light brown, mocha-colored, fecal mess. Just gruel. Humanity as gruel. Bland, flavorless, and, no problems, man. Yeah, it's just fuck you, Anthony Bourdain. If you were still here, I'd slap you in that big giant. Plus, he's one of these guys with that huge head. Apparently, massive fucking totemic head on him, right? Very high. I don't think I like that. I don't think I like that in person. Phil says, didn't he wear a hemp bracelet or a Kabbalah one his whole life? Can't trust a guy who does that. Yeah, no. Did he? Yeah, just fuck him, And his whole story was, I used to be a junkie, man, and now I'm clean. Okay, get over it, fucker. Who hasn't been a junkie for a while? Who hasn't done that? Who hasn't either been a junkie or prostituted themselves on the streets as a youth? It's boring. It's frankly boring. Oh, yeah, okay. So apparently it's the 10th anniversary of Ferguson, too. This is something I did not know. And so they're not rioting so much as they're having all these peaceful but very angry protests, apparently. And I don't know if it was last night or just a couple of days ago that a cop caught a brain injury trying to make an arrest when they went out to the to the cop shop and started tearing down the fence.
All right.
So, time for the angry black man interlude.
Called this press conference to talk about an event from last night.
Voice choking with emotion.
We had protesters across the street at the Andy Worm parking lot. I have my PO provide you with times and all that stuff after this press conference. But we had protesters lined up across the street here at Andy Worm parking lot. For the majority of the night, they were all peaceful. In fact, we even began blocking our streets out here on South Florissant Road. We allowed the protesters to block our streets out here. Not only did we
That was your
allow the
first
protesters
mistake.
to block our street, we even provided a
Here in, no, not here in Seattle. I forget, I'm not in Portland anymore. I came back to Seattle and I thought I was back, and I often, or once or twice, I found myself saying here in Portland, because I feel like I'm back in Portland, just because I'm back in the Northwest. But they used to let the Antifa shut down streets. That was a thing. That was a thing that started with the in 2020 with the BLM protests. It was huge in Portland. It got ridiculous. Antifa in Portland is a little organized. That's a relative term. Organized is it's kind of LARPy, their organization, but they do organize, and it's a big part of the original anarchist. And you got to remember, our Antifa, they're basically picking up to the extent that it's, the higher level thinking, such as it is, behind it, harks back to the original anarchists of the early 20th century. And Peter Kropotkin was his name. There were some heavyweights in the original anarchist movement. There weren't a bunch of dummies like we have now. Some of them were, actually had an intellectual analysis, right? And one of their big things, and you hear them invoking it, Antifa now, though they do seem to have gone quiet, haven't they? You hardly ever hear about them. They don't do shit. They kind of went quiet when Biden came into office. Isn't that curious? It's almost like the money ran out. But one of their big things was mutual aid, right? Is that the phrase? Mutual aid. It means we will take over the role of, we're anarchists and we're totally against government, state, and organization. But we still want those things like, basically like policing and fire departments and ambulances, right? But we'll do it for ourselves. And that's mutual aid. So the Portland anarchists, Antifa, in 2020, they had their own little ambulances. They had their own, street control. They had their own security, their own cops, basically, which were a nightmare. Basically thugs, the worst police you can imagine, right? No accountability. Yeah, so they started trying to develop their own stuff. And you got to realize, some of the younger and dumber, crazier anarchists in Antifa in Portland in 2020 really thought they were going to take over the city, and they really expected, like at this point now, they expected to be running things. It sounds crazy, but yeah, they expected to take over the city. It was funny, their little self-created ambulances, they always painted them black. And, who knows where they get their vehicles, right? They would get their hands on vehicles since the cops weren't enforcing the law, and particularly against the anarchists. So they'd get their hands on these little utility vehicles. And, of course, ambulances had to be painted black, So these little... and they would get these little like mini Sprinter vans. I don't know what they're called, but they're like a Sprinter van. You know what a Sprinter van is. But they found 2 or 3 of these, it seemed, or maybe I just kept seeing the same one over and over again. It's like a mini Sprinter van, like a little minivan-sized thing, and they would paint it black and put a red cross on it and run around and play, paramedic. Just so. Anyway. That's where it was. And so last night, Ferguson, it was a little nostalgia trip for, the Ferguson rioters, who are the original rioters, right? 2015. Was it 2015? They're saying it's the 10-year anniversary. I could have swore it was 2015. I guess it's 2014, probably when Michael Brown was shot and killed by a cop after trying to take the guy's gun. That was the Obama administration, remember? That was the beginning of all this shit. People let Obama off the hook, and they don't realize, yeah, we're at the 10-year point of a particular campaign to take over the country using this pretext of black racist police brutality, or racist police brutality against blacks. You know, and frankly, it is not. It's not working. 10 years ago, Obama and Holder and all the people beneath them who launched this little intifada, is what it is, you know, they expected to be a lot farther along now. They've done a lot of damage. They've caused a lot of harm. They've gotten people killed. They've made cities, and most notably, they made black neighborhoods probably more dangerous than they were going into this whole project. But you got to remember, and we all forget, because there's so much. You can't see the forest for the trees. There's so many outrages that you forget. They expected, when they launched this shit in Obama's second term, when he knew he didn't have to run for office again, and they launched this little intifada of theirs, they expected it to be a lot farther along. They expected to have more control, even now, than they have affected, you know.
Car on the north end, and on the north end and on the south end, so the protesters couldn't get hit by vehicles. Sometime throughout the night, the protesters were violently shaking our fence at this police station. Again, we did not even react. We stayed here, let them shake the fence.
We didn't react,
That happened several times throughout the night, up until the point that they broke the bottom portions of our fence. They destroyed property on our police department's parking lot. It was at that time I sent out an arrest team to make an arrest for destruction of property. My team got out there.
That was your mistake.
Was assaulted by a number of the protesters that were out there on the scene. As a result, one of my police officers suffered a severe brain injury. He is at an area hospital right now, fighting for his life. And I'm gonna break away a little bit from what I was planning to talk about. This police department, this Ferguson Police Department, since 2014, has been a punching bag for this community. The police department back in 2014, we don't even have them officers here anymore. So what are you protesting? These officers not even here no more. Everything that the activist community has advocated for, as far as body-worn cameras, implicit bias training, crisis intervention training, all this stuff, we have done all of this.
Gee, it's almost like all that bullshit was not going to get you off the hook. Golly, imagine that.
What are we protesting? What is it? We even changed the uniforms at this police department because people said that the old uniforms triggered.
You know, gosh, it's almost like you shouldn't, participate in this bullshit. Maybe you should have stood up for yourselves from the get. You know, those officers aren't even here. Were those officers even guilty of anything? I'm thinking Ferguson is the Michael Brown, but it's hard to keep track. But I'm pretty sure you're talking about one officer, Darren Wilson, right? Who didn't do anything wrong, by the way. But anyway, you're just whining, cop.
Your people. What are we doing?
We even changed the uniforms because they were triggering. Yeah, maybe at that point you should have said, this is getting stupid.
10 years later, I got an officer fighting for his life. It's enough, and I'm done with it. We're not doing it here in Ferguson. Our community is united behind us. Our community is fed up. We want to heal. Our community want to heal.
I bet that's true, too.
To peacefully protest, but we damn sure ain't going to allow you to destroy.
I bet most people in Ferguson don't agree with the protest bullshit. It's just the protesters and the hardcore dipshit thugs in the black neighborhoods who just don't like cops because they're idiots, you know. I'm coming to hate cops because of what they represent, you know, of what they're in the role now of like the British cops. Of enforcing this bullshit, right? The cops are now in the role of enforcing all this stuff that this police chief is complaining about. But I still can't get with this libertarian view. Oh, we hate cops because, you know, authority, man, bad. You know, oh, don't pull me over for speeding. I don't answer questions to show my license. You know, shut the fuck up. You guys are the problem. With that said, though, I'm anti-cop now.
This city,
I mean, it's confusing, but I'm still confused.
we ain't gonna allow you to hurt none of these police officers. We are united here in this city. We're done with it. We're not doing it anymore. I'll take any questions anybody got. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk a little bit more about what exactly happened to cause the break-in?
So my officer went out to effect an arrest on an individual who broke and stole portions of our fencing out here, a large portion of our fencing. And as he approached the suspect, he was charged violently with the suspect's shoulder, which knocked him down, which he suffered a head injury as a result of that.
Can you clarify too if this happened, if the arrest and the injury happened before or after midnight? We're just trying to get a time.
It was before midnight.
Can you explain how the officer got his injury? Because I believe I saw that. Like, what actually happened?
Yeah, after he got charged, he fell backwards and hit his head. He fell backwards and hit his head.
Okay, did he run into somebody? Did he trip? Did he slip?
No, they ran into him. The suspect, the protester, yes.
What details do you have about the officer? How long has he been on board?
He's been with the Ferguson Police Department since January the 2nd of this year. Prior to that, he was a St. Louis County police officer.
Is there any update? There was a woman that had a seizure out there that needed medical attention.
Yeah, and my team, along with the Ferguson Fire Department, went out there to assist that lady with her seizure.
Did that happen did she have any kind of interaction or physical interaction or contact with any officers?
I don't know. All I know is our officers responded by helping that young lady during her seizure.
Were any other officers injured?
I'm sorry?
Were any other officers?
Yes, I had another officer that suffered an ankle injury and another officer that suffered some abrasions.
The person who injured the officer that is in critical condition, Chief Doyle, do we know anything about that person, where that person comes from?
That individual is in custody, and I'm going to let our prosecutor talk about that.
Yeah, you're in good hands with all these black people running things.
First and foremost, I want to start by saying our prayers are with the officer and his family. I just left the hospital myself, and you know, I always talk about, you know, the toughest part of this job is when we have a family that's lost a loved one that we can't bring justice to, and I gotta tweak that. The toughest thing that I've had to do is talk and console with a mother who doesn't know if her child is going to make it. And
All right, yeah, you know, when black guys start talking, I just tune out, man. All right, yeah, maybe you should rap it, brother. Maybe if you tried rhyming, you know. Nah, I'm still not listening, but yeah, okay. Anyway, that's the story there. That's all that's happening there. The good news is that you hardly hear about it, the so-called 10th anniversary of this horse shit. Here, this is my background. This is our background for the stream. It's supposed to be Nero fiddling while Rome burns. yeah, the good news is there's no real appetite for the bullshit around Ferguson. Mostly people are distracted by other things, but I think most people are exhausted. Normal people are exhausted. Part of the tragedy of 2020 was you got all your normies to sort of acquiesce to the bullshit, or there are, for a time, it seemed like your normies became almost radicalized. Like, all these people who were saying, yeah, all these normies who were one day totally Normieville, decided, oh yeah, that there's something to all this radical bullshit. Oop. All right, I'm trying to open that link somebody provided me. And we will in a moment. I don't know. I'm fumbling here because I don't know what I want to talk about next. Tom Anderson says, sometimes it's hard not to be black-pilled. Yeah, my new, I'm a great hater, especially if petty small things that set me off. But one of the little things that sets me off is on Twitter. It seems to be a big thing with some of my least favorite people. The Zio right, the Baptist types. And they'll often use this, it's its own little meme, I guess. And you're blackpilling. They'll often use this picture of De Niro from one of the classic gangster movies. I don't know if it's Goodfella or what. And he's giving this look like, I can't believe you look to somebody. It's that picture, and it says, it'll be something like, oh man, cops are beating up Ferguson protesters and you're blackpilling? One was, it was about those idiots, those Jewish Hillel idiots who showed up at the pro-Palestinian protests and started making monkey noises at a fat black girl. And somebody said that, basically. People are publicly making monkey noises at fat black women and you're blackpilling? So this thing's been out there for a couple of years, and it's always some stupid little shit like that, or it's often like mistaken, like taking the Hillel, the phony frat boys, defending Old Glory, and taking that as a good thing. When, to me, when I saw that happening, I just thought, okay, it's part of this whole thing that's this unfortunate happening on the right after October 7th, where the Zionists and the phony rightists who are Jewish or Judeophiles are trying to steer the whole of the right into this Trumpian territory, this super pro-Israel territory, and conflating Zionism and Israel with white American patriotism. And this thing's been going on, and it's always some stupid little shit. And it has this copy, this cope. It has the stink of impotent cope on it. And I just get the feeling that they're going to be doing this for a couple more years, and things just get worse and worse and worse for us, deteriorating, and we get these stupid little pseudo victories that they cite. And you're blackpilling? Shut the fuck up. I'm not even going to talk about blackpilling, whitepilling. I'm just going to resist that. That doesn't mean anything. Morale's important, but honestly, personally, I have no idea how to improve morale. I'm such a downer guy. I am so obsessed with the negative things. But that's my approach. It's critical. My approach is critical. I'm not a cheerleader. We need other people to do that. I want to promote people who know how to do that, positive people who can do that. I'm not that guy. You need me too. That's all I'm saying. You need the critic too. You need the so-called black pillar too. Yeah. Bear says, Tom, I used to be law enforcement. Anything you say will be used against you. Even being buddy-buddy will make a cop think you're trying to hide something. Yes, that's the worst thing about cops, right? Because they try to get you in, and I'm susceptible to this. It's a good thing I'm not a criminal, because I'd get killed. I'd get caught immediately. I wouldn't make it. This idea, I'm just your pal, right? Cops have to be, like I said, I defend policing. I defend the necessity for police. That's all I defend. And when I say all this shit, all I am criticizing is the libertarian, the childish, autistic libertarian instinct to think we could just have no cops and you know, we'll sort it out. Because we're all good people, apparently. Yeah. We'll sort it out ourselves without cops. No, you need cops. That said, most cops are assholes. Policing is dirty work, right? It requires the cop to be kind of like criminals. That is, they have to hide their motivations. They have to lie repeatedly. They have to con you, right? I'm your pal. I'm here to help you. Like where you see these, you know, when they interrogate people. We're just trying to sort this out, man. We're just trying to help you. And I do have that super long article. I swear to God, it might end up a book. I need to get more subjects, but I've been writing this super long article that's been out there for months, maybe a year, that I cannot corral. I can't find the time or inclination or energy to get it all together. It's about Tiny Toisi and Alan Sweeney, two guys who the cops totally fucked over in Portland in 2021. And these guys were part of that whole Patriot Prayer group of these political neophytes who don't know shit. They just joined the fray. Maybe there's a bit of grift and LARP. Certainly a lot of LARP around their whole thing. Oh, is it showing? I think it's showing. I hope we don't get stopped, because this is a copyright violation we're seeing on the screen here. I'll have to keep an eye on it. It looks like it's spin her. Yeah. I should just... Let's just go ahead. That one will definitely get stopped. Anyway, Toisi and Alan Sweeney. One guy drew 8 years, another guy drew 10 years. And these guys were part of that whole Patriot Prayer reaction to the nationwide violence that was taking place. Really started before 2020. Of these guys, you know, like here, Antifa. They would show up to protest Donald Trump. They showed up to protest anything. But every protest was also secondarily, if not primarily, anti-cop protest. So the Patriot Prayer guys, the guys who, Antifa is hardly politically sophisticated, but compared to Patriot Prayer, they were. Compared to Patriot Prayer, they were like high-level Bolsheviks, right? I mean, the lefties are these, you know, these guys who imagine themselves intellectuals and actually read a book or two. That's what makes them so dangerous. You know, they read like 1 or 2 books and they're off to the races. And the Patriot Prayer guys were just like regular beer-drinking guys who were watching football one day and then got, you know, sort of radicalized by, you know, this nationwide phenomenon of, you know, Antifa anarchists showing up to harass the cops. So they thought they'd get in on the fun. And maybe there's some grift to it because there's fundraising going on. And their whole thing was to troll the anarchists by coming out here and holding what? Back the Blue. That was the phrase. Back the Blue riots. Not riots, I'm sorry, demonstrations. And Antifa just couldn't allow that. And Antifa would not, I mean, if it was a dozen housewives from the suburbs, they also did flag waves. They just go out and wave the American flag, and that would set off Antifa. I mean, literally, one or two of the demonstrations were just these suburbanites, and literally like housewives, who are conservative, unsophisticated conservatives, show up to wave the flag, and Antifa would show up, at least to try to intimidate them. Often they would attack them. And Patriot Prayer, again, if it's a grift, it was a very successful grift. They trolled Antifa, and repeatedly Antifa would come out and either attack them or try to intimidate. Repeatedly Antifa would show up and try and drive peaceful protests off the street because they were either pro-Donald Trump, or they were pro-police, or they were just vaguely pro-American. One of the demonstrations was Him Too. It was a demonstration during the Me Too, She Said movement. They did a Him Too or something. Oh, that really set them off. And so it's just ironic that, so the Portland police, losing their fight with Antifa, standing down and literally turning over the streets to Antifa, letting them close down streets and letting them get away with attacking other civilians. Eventually the cops were basically defeated. The mayor pulled them down. They were defunded. Their numbers were down. The cops themselves were certainly demoralized and just sick of it. Many were quitting, retiring early, or quitting to go work in some chill suburban department. So they had been beaten by 2021. They had been soundly beaten in their battle with Antifa. But there were these two guys, probably the two most prominent right-wingers was Toese and Swinney, because they were both big guys and they were both willing to go out and fight, and they would go out and talk shit, and Toese was shot in the foot at one point. They would go out and they would mix it up. But the dynamic persisted throughout, is these guys would never start it. And if Antifa, at any one of these encounters, if Antifa had not shown up and started the fight, the right-wingers would have what? They would have gone, they would have demonstrated, they would have made some speeches, and they would have gone home. So anyway, this is still occurring after the cops are powerless before Antifa. But they're not powerless regarding Patriot Prayer, right? And Patriot Prayer is absolutely despised, not just by Antifa, but at this point by the mayor, by the cops themselves, I guess. So they go out, and the guy who's now Portland's DA, who was their lead prosecutor, I've been listening to recordings of the trials, of the Toese trial. I just hate how shitty these prosecutors are. I mean, they're just shitty speakers. Anyway, Nathan Vasquez, he's now the new DA because he ran to unseat Mike Schmidt, who was one of the Soros crew, came in 2020, funded by Soros or associated organizations. Well, his lead prosecutor, Nathan Vasquez, led the prosecutions, and cops participated as witnesses, and they brought forth these Antifa people who had showed up to attack the right-wing rallies. One got bear-maced. I have footage of it. I've shown it to you before, by Swinney. One person got caught a paintball in the eye, around the eye. That was Swinney's offenses that drew him 10 years, 2 separate assault cases. And Toese didn't even touch anybody. I've got footage from that demonstration too. The joke of a demonstration that they held, the right-wingers, they went 10, 15 miles out of downtown Portland because Antifa was promising on social media for weeks ahead of this scheduled protest, we're going to show up and everybody show up and we're going to run them out of town. So the right-wingers set up like 10 miles outside of downtown. And then an intrepid group of Antifa went out there to challenge them in one of these vans. I want one of their vans. Some van that was not registered to no one. Nobody knows where this van came from. But these brave little shits from the Antifa side went out. We're going to challenge them because we can't bear the fact to think that they're out there 10 miles away having this ridiculous demonstration. I could show you footage for it. It was such a joke. The right-wingers really need production. They went out there and they were assaulted because they come barreling in there in their van in the middle of this right-wing protest. So the right-wingers go out and turned their van over. Well, Toisi didn't even lay a hand on anybody. They caught him, and he's doing 8 years. And he never laid a hand. All he did was say, "Oh, there they are. There's Antifa," and then a bunch of right wingers, I guess. And none of these guys caught assault charges. I don't know why. Went over there and chased off the little anarchist guys, and then pushed their van over. And that's it. And he drew 8 years. Nathan Vasquez, who's now the new DA, who people are saying, yay, we got rid of that horrible Soros DA. Now we got a law and order guy in there, And people are still defending these police, these police who showed up to talk about, patriot prayers, a bunch of right-wing extremists. And it's in the trial. And it's sickening to listen to this shit happen. So anyway, you defend the cops, and that's what they do. They'll show up at your trial, and they'll tell you that literally this is what one of the cops is saying. The ADL told me that Patriot Prayer is a right wing. Oh shit. All right. Okay. Thank you. We will be back momentarily. Just waiting to come back. I'm going to put a song on or something. Hopefully. I'll put a song on. Yeah. I'm going to play a song. I'll be right back because I have to use the facilities. All right. We are coming back. Let's play something. Hey there. Hey there. We back? Oh, I thought we were goner for good this time. Yeah, the ghost of Susan Wojcicki. Yeah. All right. Okay, tell you what. Enjoy this musical interlude, and I will be right back. I was scared because I think the language looked different. It said suspended for policy violations, and which sounded more permanent than what I think it usually says. So I guess that's what it says all the time. Usually I get a little notice, and it'll tell you basically that you can't play that. Just end that, and you can come back. I think, but yeah. Anyway, we'll be right back. And this is Zerbionet. Oh, I got a little scared. I've got to go calm down. Thank you, Amon Tobin. Thank you, Bionaut. Yeah, okay. Every now and then we got to play some of that. What is it called? I don't know. Intelligent dance music. I hate that fucking phrase. Anything that says anything that describes itself as intelligent or brave or beautiful, just trouble. I reject it. But, we're back. All right. And nobody's showing up. So, yeah, I mean, there needs to be better. But, when I was really into like electronic music, honestly, I could not tell you the difference between house and jungle and whatever. I just knew that a lot of the stuff I like seems to fall under this broad umbrella term, intelligent dance music. Aphex Twin, Boards of Canada, all that great old stuff. Amon Tobin. I like music. I likes the music, but it's just like everything else. I never get that much into it. I should, There's virtually every sort of enthusiasm I've had, including reading. I stopped short of getting into going into greater depth of understanding. You know what I mean? Like I thought, oh gosh, you could write a review of a book, a review of a film. But I don't even have the language, I would want to do high level stuff, and I lack the language to intelligently describe what I'm seeing, Electronica, I mean, that's fine, I guess. Electronica, right, Phil? Yeah. Glib. I think it was Ben-Hur. Yeah. I should have known. I mean, Ben-Hur is probably protected, or the Ten Commandments. That's certainly going to be protected. I'm going to quit while I'm behind. We've got no viewers. We've got nothing. So I'm going to do something I've been thinking about doing. I'm going to read you a story. Speaking of literature. Never been a big Hemingway guy. In fact, for a while I kind of hated him. But I've read the basics, I read the short stories. I read, Sun Also Rises, For Whom the Bell Tolls, of course, Old Man of the Sea, of course. But I digged out these old books. I've got these old books that are from a departed relative. That she had the Classics Club books and Treasury of American Literature books, these from the 40s and 50s, when they're trying to, when the elite still thought, at least some of them still thought they were going to raise up the level of us plebes out here by introducing us to literature. Part of my fascination with these books is what constitutes literature then, what's survived since then and what hasn't. Anyway, Big Two-Hearted River is my favorite Hemingway story. And maybe we'll just read it. I should pull it up here. I bet you can find a copy online. And I can just pull this up. Maybe I'll read it off the screen. So apparently, see, I talk about it. I never get into it enough. So apparently, come on, where are you? I know there's a copy for free out here. There's a Cliff's Notes copy. There's a YouTube. No, that's just somebody reading it. But I do realize that this needs, this does need some scenery. We need some scenery. Just a little backdrop. All right. Anyway, the lead character is just one guy goes fishing. Typical Hemingway shit. The lead character is Nick, and I think that's a recurring character. It's probably the guy from For Whom the Bell Tolls and some of the other stories about war. He's back from the war, and he goes fishing. He's seen a lot of shit, and he's psychologically, I don't know if you'd call it damaged. Maybe this is the character who has sustained. I always wondered if Hemingway was impotent, because he has the lead character who sustained a war wound that in his groin, and he's impotent. He can't have sex because his balls literally got blown off. The guy in Sun Also Rises, I remember. That was his situation. I don't know if this is the same guy. Anyway, this is a man. He's returned home from, I presume, World War I. He's seen lots of awful stuff, right? I guess that's all you need to know about it. And we're just going to read it because nobody's here. We've got like 2 people here. All right. It's in 2 parts for some reason. Big Two-Hearted River, Part 1, 1925. The train went on up the track out of sight, around one of the hills of burnt timber. Nick sat down on the bundle of canvas and bedding the baggage man had pitched out of the door of the baggage car. There was no town, nothing but the rails and the burned-over country. The 13 saloons that had lined the one street of Seney had not left a trace. The foundations of the Mansion House Hotel stuck up above the ground. The stone was chipped and split by the fire. It was all that was left of the town of Seney. Even the surface had been burned off the ground. Nick looked at the burned-over stretch of hillside where he had expected to find the scattered houses of the town, and then walked down the railroad track to the bridge over the river. The river was there. It swirled against the log spiles of the bridge. Nick looked down into the clear brown water, colored from the pebbly bottom, and watched the trout keeping themselves steady in the current with wavering fins. As he watched them, they changed their positions by quick angles, only to hold steady in the fast water again. Nick watched them a long time. He watched them holding themselves with their noses into the current, many trout in deep, fast-moving water, slightly distorted as he watched far down through the glassy convex surface of the pool, its surface pushing and swelling smooth against the resistance of the log-driven piles of the bridge. At the bottom of the pool were the big trout. Nick did not see them at first. Then he saw them at the bottom of the pool, big trout looking to hold themselves on the gravel bottom in a varying mist of gravel and sand, raised in spurts by the current. Nick looked down into the pool from the bridge. It was a hot day. A kingfisher flew up the stream. It was a long time since Nick had looked into a stream and seen trout. They were very satisfactory. As the shadow of the kingfisher moved up from the stream, a big trout shot upstream in a long angle, only his shadow marking the angle, then lost his shadow as he came through the surface of the water, caught the sun, and then, as he went back into the stream under the surface, his shadow seemed to float down the stream with the current, unresisting, to his post under the bridge where he tightened, facing up into the current. Nick's heart tightened as the trout moved. He felt all the old feeling. He turned and looked down the stream. It stretched away, pebbly bottomed, with shallows and big boulders, and a deep pool as it curved away from the foot of the bluff. Nick walked back up the ties to where his pack lay in the cinders beside the railway track. He was happy. He adjusted the pack harness around the bundle, pulling straps tight, slung the pack on his back, got his arms through the shoulder straps, and took some of the pull off of his shoulders by leaning his forehead against the wide band of the trump line. Still, it was too heavy. It was much too heavy. He had his leather rod case in his hand, and leaning forward to keep the weight of the pack high on his shoulders, he walked along the road that paralleled the railway track, leaving the burned town behind him in the heat, and then turned off around a hill with a high, fire-scarred hill on either side into a road that went back into the country. He walked along the road, feeling the ache from the pull of the heavy pack. The road climbed steadily. It was hard work walking uphill. His muscles ached and the day was hot, but Nick felt happy. He felt he had left everything behind, the need for thinking, the need to write, other needs. It was all back of him. From the time he had gotten down off the train and the baggage man had thrown his pack out of the open car door, things had been different. Sini was burned. The country was burned over and changed, but it did not matter. It could not all be burned. He knew that. He hiked along the road, sweating in the sun, climbing to cross the range of hills that separated the railway from the pine plains. The road ran on, dipping occasionally, but always climbing. Nick went on up. Finally, the road, after going parallel to the burnt hillside, reached the top. Nick leaned back against a stump and slipped out of the pack harness. Ahead of him, as far as he could see, was the pine plain. The burned country stopped off at the left with a range of hills. On ahead, islands of dark pine trees rose out of the plain. Far off to the left was the line of the river. Nick followed it with his eye and caught glints of the water in the sun. There was nothing but the pine plain ahead of him, until the far blue hills that marked the Lake Superior height of land. He could hardly see them, faint and far away in the heat light over the plain. If he looked too steadily, they were gone, but if he only half looked, they were there, the far-off hills of the height of land. Nick sat down against a charred stump and smoked a cigarette. His pack balanced on the top of the stump, harness holding ready, a hollow molded in it from his back. Nick sat smoking, looking out over the country. He did not need to get his map out. He knew where he was from the position of the river. As he smoked, his legs stretched out in front of him. He noticed a grasshopper walk along the ground and up onto his woolen sock. The grasshopper was black. As he had walked along the road, climbing, he had started many grasshoppers from the dust. They were all black. They were not the big grasshoppers with yellow and black or red and black wings whirring out from their black wing sheathing as they fly up. These were just ordinary hoppers, but all a sooty black in color. Nick had wondered about them as he walked without really thinking about them. Now, as he watched the black hopper that was nibbling at the wool of his sock with its four-way lip, he realized that they had all turned black from living in the burned-over land. He realized that the fire must have come the year before, but the grasshoppers were all black now. He wondered how long they would stay that way. Carefully, he reached his hand down and took hold of the hopper by the wings. He turned him up, all his legs walking in the air, and looked at his jointed belly. Yes, it was black too, iridescent, where the back and head were dusty. "Go on, Hopper," Nick said, speaking out loud for the first time. "Fly away somewhere." He tossed the grasshopper up into the air and watched him sail away to a charcoal stump across the road. Nick stood up. He leaned his back against the weight of his pack where it rested upright on the stump and got his arms through the shoulder straps. He stood with the pack on his back in the brow of the hill, looking out across the country toward the distant river, and then struck down the hillside away from the road. Underfoot, the ground was good walking. 200 yards down the hillside, the fire line stopped. Then it was sweet fern, growing ankle-high, to walk through, and clumps of jack pines. A long, undulating country with frequent rises and descents, sandy underfoot, and the country alive again. Nick kept his direction by the sun. He knew where he wanted to strike the river, and he kept on through the pine plain, mounting small rises to see other rises ahead of him, and sometimes from the top of a rise a great solid island of pines off to his right or his left. He broke off some sprigs of the heathery sweet fern and put them under his pack straps. The chafing crushed it, and he smelled it as he walked. He was tired and very hot, walking across the uneven, shadeless pine plain. At any time he knew he could strike the river by turning off to his left. It could not be more than a mile away, but he kept on toward the north to hit the river as far upstream as he could go in one day's walking. For some time as he walked, Nick had been in the sight of one of the big islands of pine standing out above the rolling high ground he was crossing. He dipped down, and then as he came slowly up to the crest of the bridge, he turned and made toward the pine trees. There was no underbrush in the island of pine trees. The trunks of the trees went straight up or slanted toward each other. The trunks were straight and brown without branches. The branches were high above, some interlocked to make a solid shadow on the brown forest floor. Around the grove of trees was a bare space. It was brown and soft underfoot as Nick walked on it. This was the overlapping of the pine needle floor, extending out beyond the width of the high branches. The trees had grown tall and the branches moved high, leaving in the sun this bare space they had once covered with shadow. Sharp at the edge of this extension of the forest floor commenced the sweet fern. Nick slipped off his pack and lay down in the shade. He lay on his back and looked up into the pine trees. His neck and back and the small of his back rested as he stretched. The earth felt good against his back. He looked up at the sky, through the branches, and then shut his eyes. He opened them and looked up again. There was a wind high up in the branches. He shut his eyes again and went to sleep. Nick woke stiff and cramped. The sun was nearly down. His pack was heavy and the straps painful as he lifted it on. He leaned over with the pack on and picked up the leather rod case and started out from the pine trees across the sweet fern swale toward the river. He knew it could not be more than a mile. He came down a hillside covered with stumps into a meadow. At the edge of the meadow flowed the river. Nick was glad to get to the river. He walked upstream through the meadow. His trousers were soaked with the dew as he walked. After the hot day, the dew had come quickly and heavily. The river made no sound. It was too fast and smooth. At the edge of the meadow, before he mounted to a piece of high ground to make camp, Nick looked down the river at the trout rising. They were rising to insects come from the swamp on the other side of the stream when the sun went down. The trout jumped out of the water to take them. While Nick walked through the little stretch of meadow alongside the stream, trout had jumped high out of the water. Now as he looked down the river, the insects must be settling on the surface, for the trout were feeding steadily all down the stream. As far down the long stretch as he could see, the trout were rising, making circles all down the surface of the water as though it were starting to rain. The ground rose, woody and sandy, to overlook the meadow, the stretch of river and the swamp. Nick dropped his pack and rod case and looked for a level piece of ground. He was very hungry and he wanted to make his camp before he cooked. Between two jack pines, the ground was quite level. He took the axe out of the pack and chopped out two projecting roots. That leveled a piece of ground large enough to sleep on. He smoothed out the sandy soil with his hand and pulled all the sweet fern bushes by their roots. His hands smelled good from the sweet fern. He smoothed and uprooted earth. He did not want anything making lumps under the blankets. When he had the ground smooth, he spread his 3 blankets. One he folded double next to the ground. The other 2 he spread on top. With the axe, he slid off a bright slab of pine from one of the stumps and split it into pegs for the tent. He wanted them long and solid to hold in the ground. With the tent unpacked and spread on the ground, the pack, leaning against a jack pine, looked much smaller. Nick tied the rope that served the tent for a ridge pole to the trunk of one of the pine trees and pulled the tent up off the ground with the other end of the rope and tied it to the other pine. The tent hung on the rope like a canvas blanket on a clothesline. Nick poked a pole he had cut up under the back peak of the canvas and then made it a tent by pegging out the sides. He pegged the sides out taut and drove the pegs deep, hitting them down into the ground with the flat of the axe until the rope loops were buried and the canvas was drummed tight. Across the open mouth of the tent, Nick fixed cheesecloth to keep out mosquitoes. He crawled inside under the mosquito bar with various things from the pack to put at the head of the bed under the slant of the canvas. Inside the tent, the light came through the brown canvas. It smelled pleasantly of canvas. Already there was something mysterious and homelike. Nick was happy as he crawled inside the tent. He had not been unhappy all day. This was different, though. Now things were done. There had been this to do. Now it was done. It had been a hard trip. He was very tired. That was done. He had made his camp. He was settled. Nothing could touch him. It was a good place to camp. He was there, in the good place. He was in his home where he had made it. Now he was hungry. He came out crawling under the cheesecloth. It was quite dark outside. It was lighter in the tent. Nick went over to the pack and found with his fingers a long nail and a paper sack of nails in the bottom of the pack. He drove it into the pine tree, holding it close and hitting it gently with the flat of the axe. He hung the pack up on the nail. All his supplies were in the pack. They were off the ground and sheltered now. Nick was hungry. He did not believe he had ever been hungrier. He opened and emptied a can of pork and beans and a can of spaghetti into the frying pan. "I've got a right to eat this kind of stuff, if I'm willing to carry it," Nick said. His voice sounded strange in the darkening woods. He did not speak again. He started a fire with some chunks of pine and got with the axe from a stump. Over the fire he stuck a wire grill, pushing the forelegs down into the ground with his boot. Nick put the frying pan on the grill over the flames. He was hungrier. The beans and spaghetti warmed. Nick stirred them and mixed them together. They began to bubble, making little bubbles that rose with difficulty to the surface. There was a good smell. Nick got out a bottle of tomato ketchup and cut 4 slices of bread. The little bubbles were coming faster now. Nick sat down beside the fire and lifted the frying pan off. He poured about half the contents out into the tin plate. It spread slowly on the plate. Nick knew it was too hot. He poured on some tomato ketchup. He knew the beans and spaghetti were still too hot. He looked at the fire, then at the tent. He was not going to spoil it all by burning his tongue. For years he had never enjoyed fried bananas because he had never been able to wait for them to cool. His tongue was very sensitive. He was very hungry. Across the river in the swamp, in the almost dark, he saw a mist rising. He looked at the tent once more. All right. He took a full spoonful from the plate. "Christ," Nick said. "Jesus Christ," he said happily. He ate the whole plateful before he remembered the bread. Nick finished the second plate with the bread, mopping the plate shiny. He had not eaten since a cup of coffee and a ham sandwich in the station restaurant at St. Ignace. It had been a very fine experience. He had been that hungry before, but had not been able to satisfy it. He could have made camp hours before if he had wanted to. There were plenty of good places to camp on the river. But this was good. Nick tucked 2 big chips of pine under the grill. The fire flared up. He had forgotten to get water for the coffee. Out of the pack he had got a folding canvas bucket and walked down the hill, across the edge of the meadow, to the stream. The other bank was in the white mist. The grass was wet and cold as he knelt at the bank and dipped the canvas bucket into the stream. It bellied and pulled hard in the current. The water was ice cold. Nick rinsed the bucket and carried it full up to the camp. Up, away from the stream, it was not so cold. Nick drove another big nail and hung up the bucket full of water. He dipped the coffee pot half full and put some more chips under the grill into the fire and put the pot on. He could not remember which way he had made coffee. He could remember an argument about it with Hopkins, but not which side he had taken. He decided to bring it to a boil. He remembered that it was Hopkins' way. He had once argued about everything with Hopkins. While he waited for the coffee to boil, he opened a small can of apricots. He liked to open cans. He emptied the can of apricots out into a tin cup. While he watched the coffee on the fire, he drank the juice syrup of the apricots, carefully at first to keep from spilling, then meditatively, sucking the apricots down. They were better than fresh apricots. The coffee boiled as he watched. The lid came up and coffee and grounds ran down the side of the pot. Nick took it off the grill. It was a triumph for Hopkins. He put sugar in the empty apricot cup and poured some of the coffee out to cool. It was too hot to pour, and he used his hat to hold the handle of the coffee pot. He would not let it steep in the pot at all. Not the first cup. It should be straight, Hopkins all the way. Hop deserved that. He was a very serious coffee drinker. He was the most serious man Nick had ever known. Not heavy, serious. That was a long time ago. Hopkins spoke without moving his lips. He had played polo. He made millions of dollars in Texas. He had borrowed car fare to go to Chicago when the wire came that his first big well had come in. He could have wired for money. That would have been too slow. They called Hop's girl the Blonde Venus. Hop did not mind because she was not his real girl. Hopkins said very confidently that none of them would make fun of his real girl. He was right. Hopkins went away when the telegram came. That was on the Black River. It took 8 days for the telegram to reach him. Hopkins gave away his .22 caliber Colt automatic pistol to Nick. He gave his camera to Bill. It was to remember him always by. They were all going fishing again next summer. The hophead was rich. He would get a yacht, and they would all cruise along the north shore of Lake Superior. He was excited but serious. They said goodbye, and all felt bad. It broke up the trip. They never saw Hopkins again. That was a long time ago on the Black River. Nick drank the coffee according to Hopkins. The coffee was bitter. Nick laughed. It made a good ending to the story. His mind was starting to work. He knew he could choke it because he was tired enough. He spilled the coffee out of the pot and shook the grounds loose into the fire. He lit a cigarette and went inside the tent. He took off his shoes and trousers, sitting on the blankets, rolled the shoes up inside the trousers for a pillow, and got in between the blankets. Out through the front of the tent, he watched the glow of the fire when the night wind blew on it. It was a quiet night. The swamp was perfectly quiet. Nick stretched under the blanket comfortably. A mosquito hummed close to his car. Nick sat up and lit a match. The mosquito was on the canvas over his head. Nick moved the match quickly up to it. The mosquito made a satisfactory hiss in the flame. The match went out. Nick lay down again under the blanket. He turned on his side and shut his eyes. He was sleepy. He felt sleep coming. He curled up under the blanket and went to sleep. That's part one. Part two. Big Two-Hearted River, part two. In the morning, the sun was up and the tent was starting to get hot. Nick crawled out under the mosquito netting stretched across the mouth of the tent to look at the morning. The grass was wet on his hands as he came out. He held his trousers and his shoes in his hands. The sun was just up over the hill. There was the meadow, the river, and the swamp. There were birch trees in the green of the swamp on the other side of the river. The river was clear and smoothly fast in the early morning. Down about 200 yards were 3 logs all the way across the stream. They made the water smooth and deep above them. As Nick watched, a mink crossed the river on the logs and went into the swamp. Nick was excited. He was excited by the early morning and the river. He was really too hurried to eat breakfast, but he knew he must. He built a little fire and put on the coffee pot. While the water was heating in the pot, he took an empty bottle and went down over the edge of the high ground to the meadow. The meadow was wet with dew, and Nick wanted to catch grasshoppers for bait before the sun dried the grass. He found plenty of good grasshoppers. They were at the base of the grass stems. Sometimes they clung to a grass stem. They were cold and wet with the dew and could not jump until the sun had warmed them. Nick picked them up, taking only the medium-sized brown ones, and put them into the bottle. He turned over a log, and just under the shelter of the edge were several hundred hoppers. It was a grasshopper lodging house. Nick put about 50 of the medium browns into the bottle. While he was picking up the hoppers, the others warmed in the sun and commenced to hop away. They flew when they hopped. At first they made one flight and stayed stiff when they landed, as though they were dead. Nick knew that by the time he was through with breakfast they would be as lively as ever. Without dew in the grass, it would take him all day to catch a bottle full of good grasshoppers, and he would have to crush many of them, slamming at them with his hat. He washed his hands at the stream. He was excited to be near it. Then he walked up to the tent. The hoppers were already jumping stiffly in the grass. In the bottle, warmed by the sun, they were jumping in a mass. Nick put in a pine stick as a cork. He plugged the mouth of the bottle enough so the hoppers could not get out and left plenty of air passage. He had rolled the log back and knew he could get grasshoppers there every morning. Nick laid the bottle full of jumping grasshoppers against a pine trunk. Rapidly, he mixed some buckwheat flour with water and stirred it smooth. 1 cup of flour, 1 cup of water. He put a handful of coffee in the pot and dipped a lump of grease out of a can and slid it sputtering across the hot skillet. On the smoking skillet, he poured smoothly the buckwheat batter. It spread like lava, the grease spitting sharply. Around the edges, the buckwheat cake began to firm, then brown, then crisp. The surface was bubbling slowly to porousness. Nick pushed under the browned undersurface with a fresh pine chip. He shook the skillet sideways, and the cake was loose on the surface. I won't try and flop it, he thought. He slid the chip of clean wood all the way under the cake and flopped it over onto its face. When it was cooked, Nick regreased the skillet. He used all the batter. It made another big flapjack and one smaller one. Nick ate a big flapjack and a smaller one covered with apple butter. He put apple butter on the third cake, folded it over twice, wrapped it in oiled paper, and put it in his shirt pocket. He put the apple butter jar back in the pack and cut bread for 2 sandwiches. In the pack he found a big onion. He sliced it in 2 and peeled the silky outer skin. Then he cut 1/2 into slices and made onion sandwiches. He wrapped them in oiled paper and buttoned them in the other pocket of his khaki shirt. He turned the skillet upside down on the grill, drank the coffee, sweetened and yellow-brown with the condensed milk in it, and tidied up the cap. It was a good cap. Nick took his fly rod out of the leather rod case, jointed it, and shoved the rod case back into the tent. He put on the reel and threaded the line through the guides. He had to hold it from hand to hand as he threaded it, or it would slip back through his own weight. It was a heavy, double-tapered fly line. Nick had paid $8 for it a long time ago. It was made heavy to lift back in the air and come forward flat and heavy and straight to make it possible to cast a fly which has no weight. Nick opened the aluminum leader box. The leaders were coiled between the damp flannel pads. Nick had wet the pads at the water cooler on the train up to St. Ignace. It was the damp pads the gut leaders had softened. In the damp pads, the gut leaders had softened, and Nick unrolled one and tied it by a loop at the end to the heavy fly line. He fastened a hook on the end of the leader. It was a small hook, very thin and springy. Nick took it from his hook book, sitting at the rod across his lap. He tested the knot and the spring of the rod by pulling the line taut. It was a good feeling. He was careful not to let the hook bite into his finger. He started down to the stream, holding his rod. The bottle of grasshoppers hung from his neck by a thong tied in half hitches around the neck of the bottle. His landing net hung by a hook from his belt. Over his shoulder was a long flour sack tied at each corner into an ear. The cord went over his shoulder. The sack flapped against his legs. Nick felt awkward and professionally happy with all his equipment hanging from him. The grasshopper bottle swung against his chest. In his shirt, the breast pockets bulged against him with the lunch and his fly hook. He stepped into the stream. It was a shock. His trousers clung tight to his legs. His shoes felt the gravel. The water was a rising cold shock. Rushing, the current sucked against his legs. Where he stepped in, the water was over his knees. He waded with the current. The gravel slid under his shoes. He looked down at the swirl of water below each leg and tipped up the bottle to get a grasshopper. The first grasshopper gave a jump in the neck of the bottle and went out into the water. He was sucked under in the whirl by Nick's right leg and came to the surface a little way downstream. He floated rapidly, kicking. In a quick circle, breaking the smooth surface of the water, he disappeared. A trout had taken him. Another hopper poked his face out of the bottle. His antennae wavered. He was getting his front legs out of the bottle to jump. Nick took him by the head and held him while he threaded the slim hook under his chin, down through his thorax, and into the last segments of his abdomen. The grasshopper took hold of the hook with his front feet, spitting tobacco juice on it. Nick dropped him into the water. Holding the rod in his right hand, he let out line against the pull of the grasshopper and the current. He stripped off line from the reel with his left hand and let it run free. He could see the hopper in the little waves of the current. It went out of sight. There was a tug on the line. Nick pulled against the taut line. It was his first strike. Holding the now living rod across the current, he brought in the line with his left hand. The rod bent in jerks, the trout pumping against the current. Nick knew it was a small one. He lifted the rod straight up into the air. It bowed with the pull. He saw the trout in the water, jerking with his head and body against the shifting tangent of the line in the stream. Nick took the line in his left hand and pulled the trout, thumping tiredly against the current, to the surface. His back was mottled, the clear water over gravel color, his side flashing in the sun. The rod under his right arm, Nick stopped, dipping his right hand into the current. He held the trout never still with his moist right hand, while he unhooked the barb from his mouth, then dropped him back into the stream. He hung steadily in the current, then shifted to the bottom beside a stone. Nick reached down his hand to touch him, his arm to the elbow underwater. The trout was steady in the moving stream, resting on the gravel beside a stone. As Nick's fingers touched his smooth, cool underwater feeling, he was gone in a shadow across the bottom of the stream. He's all right, Nick thought. He was only tired. He had wet his hand before he touched the trout, so he would not disturb the delicate mucus that covered him. If a trout was touched with a dry hand, a white fungus attacked the unprotected spot. Years before, when he had fished crowded streams with fly fishermen ahead of him and behind him, Nick had again and again come on dead trout, furry with white fungus, drifted against a rock or floating belly up in some pool. Nick did not like to fish with other men on the river. Unless they were of your party, they spoiled it. He wallowed down the stream, above his knees in the current, through the 50 yards of shallow water above the pile of logs that crossed the stream. He did not rebait his hook and held it in his hand as he waited. He was certain he could catch small trout in the shallows, but he did not want them. There would be no big trout in the shallows this time of day. Now the water deepened up his thighs sharply and coldly. Ahead was the smooth, dammed back flood of water above the logs. The water was smooth and dark. On the left, the lower edge of the meadow. On the right, the swamp. Nick leaned back against the current and took a hopper from the bottle. He threaded the hopper on the hook and spat on him for good luck. Then he pulled several yards of line from the reel and tossed the hopper out ahead into the fast, dark water. It floated down towards the logs. Then the weight of the line pulled the bait under the surface. Nick held the rod in his right hand, letting the line run out through his fingers. There was a long tug. Nick struck, and the rod came alive and dangerous, bent double, the line tightening, coming out of water, tightening, all in a heavy, dangerous, steady pull. Nick felt the moment when the leader would break if the strain increased and let the line go. The reel ratcheted into a mechanical shriek as the line went out in a rush. Too fast. Nick could not check it, the line rushing out, the reel note rising as the line ran out. With the core of the reel showing, his heart feeling stopped with the excitement. Leaning back against the current that mounted icily his thighs, Nick thumbed the reel hard with his left hand. It was awkward getting his thumb inside the fly reel frame. As he put on pressure, the line tightened into sudden hardness, and beyond the logs, a huge trout went high out of the water. As he jumped, Nick lowered the tip of the rod, but he felt, as he dropped the tip to ease the strain, the moment when the strain was too great, the hardness too tight. Of course, the leader had broken. There was no mistaking the feeling when the all-spring left the line and it became dry and hard. Then it went slack. His mouth dry, his heart down, Nick reeled in. He had never seen so big a trout. There was a heaviness, a power not to be held, and then the bulk of him as he jumped. He looked as broad as a salmon. Nick's hand was shaky. He reeled in slowly. The thrill had been too much. He felt vaguely a little sick, as though it would be better to sit down. The leader had broken where the hook was tied to it. Nick took it in his hand. He thought of the trout somewhere on the bottom, holding himself steady over the gravel, far down below the light, under the logs, with the hook in his jaw. Nick knew the trout's teeth would cut through the smell of the hook. The snell of the hook. The hook would embed itself in his jaw. He'd bet the trout was angry. Anything that size would be angry. That was a trout. He had been solidly hooked, solid as a rock. He felt like a rock, too, before he started off. By God, he was a big one. By God, he was the biggest one I ever heard of. Nick climbed out onto the meadow and stood, water running down his trousers and out of his shoes squelchy. He went over and sat on the logs. He did not want to rush his sensations any. He wriggled his toes in the water in his shoes and got out a cigarette from his breast pocket. He lit it and tossed the match into the fast water below the logs. A tiny trout rose at the match as it swung around in the fast current. Nick laughed. He would finish the cigarette. He sat on the logs, smoking, drying in the sun warm on his back, the river shallow ahead, entering the woods, curving into the woods, shallows, light glittering, big water-smooth rocks, cedars along the bank and white birches, the logs warm in the sun, smooth to sit on, without bark, gray to the touch. Slowly the feeling of disappointment left him. It went away slowly, the feeling of disappointment that came sharply after the thrill that made his shoulders ache. It was all right now. His rod lying out on the logs, Nick tied a new hook on the leader, pulling the gut tight until it crimped into itself in a hard knot. He baited up, then picked up the rod and walked to the far end of the logs to get into the water, where it was not too deep. Under and beyond the logs was a deep pool. Nick walked around the shallow shelf near the swamp shore until he came out on the shallow bed of the stream. On the left, where the meadow ended and the woods began, a great elm tree was uprooted. Gone over in a storm, it lay back in the woods, its roots clotted with dirt, grass growing in them, rising a solid bank beside the stream. The river cut to the edge of the uprooted tree. From where Nick stood, he could see deep channels, like ruts, cut in the shallow bed of the stream by the flow of the current. Pebbly where he stood, and pebbly and full of boulders beyond. Where it curved near the tree roots, the bed of the stream was marly, and between the ruts of deep water, green weed fronds swung in the current. Nick swung the rod back over his shoulder and forward, and the line, curving forward, laid the grasshopper down on one of the deep channels in the weeds. A trout struck, and Nick hooked him. Holding the rod far out toward the uprooted tree and sloshing backward in the current, Nick worked the trout, plunging, the rod bending alive, out of the danger of the weeds into the open river. Holding the rod, pumping alive against the current, Nick brought the trout in. He rushed, but always came, the spring of the rod yielding to the rushes, sometimes jerking underwater, but always bringing him in. Nick eased downstream with the rushes. The rod above his head, he led the trout over the net, then lifted. The trout hung heavy in the net, mottled trout, back in silver, sides in the meshes. Nick unhooked him, heavy sides, good to hold, big undershot jaw, and slipped him, heaving and big sliding into the long sack that hung from his shoulders in the water. Nick spread the mouth of the sack against the current, and it filled, heavy with water. He held it up, the bottom in the stream, and the water poured out through the sides. Inside at the bottom was the big trout, alive in the water. Nick moved downstream. The sack out ahead of him sunk heavy in the water, pulling from his shoulders. It was getting hot, the sun hot on the back of his neck. Nick had one good trout. He did not care about getting many trout. Now the stream was shallow and wide. There were trees along both banks. The trees of the left bank made short shadows on the current in the forenoon sun. Nick knew there were trout in each shadow. In the afternoon, after the sun had crossed toward the hills, the trout would be in the cool shadows on the other side of the stream. The very biggest ones would lie up close to the bank. You could always pick them up there on the black. When the sun was down, they all moved out into the current, just where the sun made the water blinding in the glare before it went down. You were liable to strike a big trout anywhere in the current. It was almost impossible to fish then. The surface of the water was blinding, as a mirror in the sun. Of course, you could fish upstream, but in a stream like the Black, or this, you had to wallow against the current, and in a deep place, the water piled up on you. It was no fun to fish upstream with this much current. Nick moved along through the shallow stretch, watching the banks for deep holes. A beech tree grew close beside the river, so that the branches hung down into the water. The stream went back in under the leaves. There are always trout in a place like that. Nick did not care about fishing that hole. He was sure he would get hooked in the branches. It looked deep, though. He dropped the grasshopper so the current took it underwater. Back in under the overhang, took it underwater, back in under the overhanging branch. The line pulled hard and Nick struck. The trout threshed heavily, half out of water in the leaves and branches. The line was caught. Nick pulled hard and the trout was off. He reeled in and, holding the hook in his hand, walked down the stream. Ahead, close to the left bank, was a big log. Nick saw it was hollow. Pointing up river, the current entered it smoothly. Only a little ripple spread each side of the log. The water was deepening. The top of the hollow log was gray and dry. It was partly in the shadow. Nick took the cork out of the grasshopper bottle, and a hopper clung to it. He picked him off, hooked him, and tossed him out. He held the rod far out so that the hopper on the water moved into the current flowing into the hollow log. Nick lowered the rod, and the hopper floated in. There was a heavy strike. Nick swung the rod against the pole. It felt as though he were hooked onto the log itself, except for the live feeling. He tried to force the fish out into the current. It came, heavily. The line went slack, and Nick thought the trout was gone. Then he saw him, very near, in the current, shaking his head, trying to get the hook out. His mouth was clamped shut. He was fighting the hook in the clear flowing current. Looping in the line with his left hand, Nick swung the rod to make the line taut and tried to lead the trout toward the net. But he was gone, out of sight, the line pumping. Nick fought him against the current, letting him thump in the water against the spring of the rod. He shifted the rod to his left hand, worked the trout upstream, holding his weight, fighting on the rod, and then let him down into the net. He lifted him clear out of the water, a heavy half circle in the net dripping, unhooked him and slid him into the sack. He spread the mouth of the sack and looked down in at the two big trout alive in the water. Through the deepening water, Nick waded over to the hollow log. He took the sack off over his head, the trout flopping as it came out of water, and hung it so the trout were deep in the water. Then he pulled himself up on the log and sat, the water from his trousers and boots running down into the stream. He laid his rod down, moved along to the shady end of the log, and took the sandwiches out of his pocket. He dipped the sandwiches in the cold water. The current carried away the crumbs. He ate the sandwiches and dipped his hat full of water to drink, the water running out through his hat just ahead of his drinking. It was cool in the shade, sitting on the log. He took out a cigarette and struck a match to light it. The match sunk into the gray wood, making a tiny furrow. Nick leaned over the side of the log, found a hard place, and lit the match. He sat smoking and watching the river. Ahead, the river narrowed and went into a swamp. The river became smooth and deep, and the swamp looked solid with cedar trees, their trunks close together, their branches solid. It would not be possible to walk through a swamp like that. The branches grew so low. You would have to keep almost level with the ground to move at all. You could not crash through the branches. That must be why the animals that lived in swamps were built the way they were, Nick thought. He wished he had brought something to read. He felt like reading. He did not feel like going on into the swamp. He looked down the river. A big cedar slanted all the way across the stream. Beyond that, the river went into the swamp. Nick did not want to go in there now. He felt a reaction against deep wading, with the water deepening up under his armpits, to hook a big trout in places impossible to land them. In the swamp, the banks were bare. The big cedars came together overhead. The sun did not come through, except in patches. In the fast, deep water, in the half-light, the fishing would be tragic. In the swamp, fishing was a tragic adventure. Nick did not want it. He did not want to go down the stream any further today. He took out his knife, opened it, and stuck it in the log. Then he pulled up the sack, reached into it, and brought out one of the trout. Holding him near the tail, hard to hold, alive in his hand, he whacked him against the log. The trout quivered, rigid. Nick laid him on the log in the shade and broke the neck of the other fish the same way. He laid them side by side on the log. They were fine trout. Nick cleaned them, slitting them from the vent to the tip of the jaw. All the insides and the gills and tongue came out in one piece. They were both males. long gray-white strips of milt, smooth and clean. All the insides clean and compact, coming out all together. Nick tossed the offal ashore for the minks to find. He washed the trout in the stream. When he held them back up in the water, they looked like live fish. Their color was not gone yet. He washed his hands and dried them on the log. Then he laid the trout on the sack spread out on the log, rolled them up in it, tied the bundle, and put it in the landing net. His knife was still standing, blade stuck in the log. He cleaned it on the wood and put it in his pocket. Nick stood up on the log, holding his rod, the landing net hanging heavy, then stepped into the water and splashed ashore. He climbed the bank and cut up into the woods toward the high ground. He was going back to camp. He looked back. The river just showed through the trees. There were plenty of days coming when he could fish the swamp. All right. Has anybody left? That was Big 200 River. All right. So as you probably guessed, the swamp represents something for this guy who's just come back from war and is somewhat damaged psychologically from his experiences. The swamp represents, I don't know, remembrance, not just death, but his experience with death that he doesn't want to yet revisit. He wants to live, so he's out there in the open. But there are big trout in the swamp, in the tragic swamp. Eventually, he's going to have to go back into the swamp. Yeah, okay. Yes, Phil, I can't believe he mixes beans and spaghetti and then ketchup. Uh-huh. Glib says, over the bank, Klaus Schwab showed up. You will eat the hoppers and be happy. Leave the trout alone. They're for us. They're not for you, the trout. Yeah. Well, I think the idea with him eating that simple meal, is that when you're genuinely hungry, like in that sort of situation, whatever you eat tastes really awesome, right? Well, that's the idea. All right. All right. Yeah, Nick mixes his beans with his spaghetti. Cannot forgive that. Oh. All right. I think that's it. When I'm just reading shit, that's it. All right. And nobody's going to come out to watch. But we will be back next Sunday. Maybe in between. Maybe we'll do a little in between stream on Wednesday. All right. Yeah, that's good clip. Klaus Schwab showed up. I think Hemingway, I can understand why you wouldn't like it. I mean, the story like that, right? It's amazing. He's just going to describe this, trout fishing. Though it's always when he gets on trout fishing that he's at his best. I think there's a scene in The Sun also now in For Whom the Bell Tolls, where a couple of guys go trout fishing, and it's just a very simple description of, trout, catching the trout and laying them out, like in here. There's something really beautiful about it. All right, so we'll do Wednesday. 11 o'clock. Yeah, and that will be it. Oh, it's almost 1 o'clock. I guess we've been on for a little while now. What do we have? I'm looking for the time. All right. Wednesday, 11 o'clock is our midweek check-in. I was going to talk a bit about this, just briefly. It's funny. There's this woman, Anita Dunn. She's been around the Democratic Party forever. She's ugly and stupid. And it's one of these really ugly, stupid people that for some reason finds himself at the top of the Democratic Party running things. No, I don't know what her ethnicity is. But she had this long, apparently she was one of the people who was behind Joe Biden and was behind getting Joe Biden to debate Trump, the disastrous debate. There was just one thing in here she said that I thought was quite telling. So she's presenting, and you can't trust these assholes. Maybe it's true, maybe the conspiracy is true, that they actually set Biden up to reveal his lack of sentience and establish Kamala Harris. But what she's presenting as, she's angry that Trump was forced down. She thinks he did fine in the debate and sees no problem with him as president and thinks he was a great president. But anyway, it was just a quote in here where she's resigned herself now. Again, this is all probably phony. She's resigned herself now to Kamala, and they've all gotten behind Kamala, and the Democrats seem to be getting a boost from the replacement. They've enlivened all the stupid women out there and others, and they do seem to have gotten a bump out of installing Kamala. But there was just something she said where she's talking about, she's kind of resigned to it, how she said, Biden was important because he was a pipeline by which they delivered Kamala to her current position, just, a step away from the presidency. And that's striking how they don't even pretend to respect the democratic process. They don't even pretend that there's any concern about what's just happened, how, they had their candidate who got the votes. He's horrible, but, he got the votes, and they just replaced him with this woman who couldn't win a single delegate, right? But here she is on the verge, right? They did a little end around the voters, their own stupid voters, many of whom, are now out there cheering on this woman because here she is. I think one of the greatest things about Joe Biden's legacy will be that he made sure there was a pipeline in which Kamala Harris was going to be the natural person everyone turned to if something happened to him. Was this in place the whole time? You have to wonder, right? So they obviously pressured him to install Harris. Harris didn't like him. Remember, she attacked him as a racist, and he refused to budge on it. And if you remember the 2020 Democratic primaries, Biden was trying to finesse it, and Biden didn't seem to have it in for Kamala, but she definitely seemed to have it in for him. And then somehow she's forced on him early on, probably because the Democrats, and they got Biden, and he's in there entirely because he's pliable. He's not going to have his own mind about anything. This is before he starts literally losing his mind. But they need somebody behind him, right, that is going to be just as pliable, because not just because he's old, but also because they're thinking he's going to be one term, and then they're going to push Kamala on the public, 4 years later, after they've done, and keeping in mind that demographic changes are every year make it harder and harder to beat the Democrats. Demographic changes mean more stupid brown people who are just going to vote for the Democrats and the Gibbs. Anyway, I think Anita Dunn in this Politico interview gives the game away, but the vast majority of political readers do not care. Even as they're talking about, even as they think they're saving democracy, they don't really get into details because people are so stupid now. And we're all corrupt. Forget the politicians. You and I are corrupted. We, the public, are corrupt in that we let this happen and we're all just cool with it. Yeah. Phil the Kill says we have to contend with the WQ one of these days. Yeah, no, we have to take women out of get them out of power. They're a disaster. I don't know. Maybe I don't care. I don't really like America anymore. I was a patriot when this all started. I was a genuine patriot as late as 2016. I voted for Trump, thinking he was our best choice. As obviously flawed as he is. I'm not a patriot. I do not like America. What's the old saying? I think it was during the McCarthy hearings, and it was a liberal who said something about patriotism. Well, you have to make it a country that you can love. It has to be a country worth the patriotism, something along those lines. I don't know how you can be a patriot of this country that leads this globo homo. Remember that phrase? World order, that does what this country does. I mean, how can you? I don't deny self-interest. I think a lot of people have been very critical of Saylor because he seems to have, no real concern about any of this. Like I've said about Saylor, he seems committed to wherever the establishment is going to take us. He's going to criticize, and he's going to talk about what he talks about, and some small part of it is still genuinely controversial and relevant, but he has clearly made the decision that he's not going to be a genuine dissident. You know what I mean? If his little milquetoast ideas about citizenism, phony ideas, aren't going to take, he's fine with that. He's going to go wherever the establishment takes him. Forget that they're evil. Forget that they're, they want to force on the world LGBTQ trans horse shit. Forget that there's no justification for the foreign policy. Forget that they openly hate us. He's not going to be, a revolutionary. He's not going to be opposed in toto like you and I are to what we called it, for lack of a better word, the establishment. There's just no way. At the end of the day, when push comes to shove, he's going to sit down and accept where these people take us, wherever it is. A lot of people had made that call. And I have to acknowledge that maybe they're more realistic because here I sit, I work, I pay taxes, I'm still part of it. I talk a good game, but I do nothing against it. Because what can you do? It's like denouncing the ground under your feet. We're stuck with America. The sad thing is, America's not stuck with us. And that's what they're saying. Basically, the establishment is saying, neener, neener, neener. Or is it this? You're stuck with us, but we're not stuck with you. We're going to replace you. And your role is just to eat the bugs and die off. Hawaii. Yeah. Anyway, I just like to end on a positive note. You know that. All right. So what is the outro? What would you like to hear on the way out the door? What does Bubba's playlist have to say about it? Oh. All right. Well, I want to play this Melancholia opening sequence. I wonder if I'll get nailed. We're just going to try it. Because that's such a downer note, and this is such a downer, beautiful downer scene. Let's just try it. Let's see if we get through it before they take us off the air. All right. Thank you all. We'll see you on we'll see you hopefully Wednesday, 11. Certainly on next Sunday at 11. And God bless you. I won't read. unless you want to. Any requests for short reads? I'm really into old stuff now, right now, as you can see. All right. God bless you. Go forth and be dissidents. Oh no, this is the wrong one. Well, just play it. I wanted the Wagner, but let's just play this one. Hang on, I'm not sharing it yet, am I? All right, here we go. This is from Lars von Trier's Melancholia. This is not the original music, though.